Here we are with another domain knowledge
Yeah.
share.
Yeah, we're going to have a really good discussion this week. It seems like a really simple concept, development approach and life cycle. But you know what? By looking at this and thinking about this and talking to my students about this, this is a major decision that we make. And oftentimes we make it without any thought. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit. To set the stage, though, when we talk about development approach and life cycle, we're talking about how the work's going to get done and how we're going to manage the work, right? And you have to think about it this way. One of my mentors, by the way, I was just talking to him here about 5 minutes ago, and we were laughing about this same thing. He had been managing the design of a lot of very bleeding edge technologies in a silicon manufacturing environment. And he'd been doing that for 20 years. And he came over to the organization I was brought into at the same time. And so because of our natures, we connected. And I got front row seat on a lot of the ways he led the initial work and the planning of projects. And I noticed he started off by finding out what the people were like and how they approached problem solving and how they actually looked at the work. And then he would do something, and he did this with all of his teams. He'd actually look at the work itself, and then he wouldn't make a decision. He'd say, okay, guys, this is your nature towards getting work done, and this is the problem we have today. What do you think? Do you think the way you approach your work will fit with the deliverable? This always stunned the teams. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. And he had to break it down. And he actually got this down into, I watched him over about 2 years. He got it down into a script. And he said, look, guys, this is really bleeding edge stuff. Do you think we can use traditional approaches to get this stuff done? Are we going to do the work and the deliverable a service if we build a rigid plan? And at that point, once he said that, everybody clicked and they said, we don't have to just change the deliverable. We have to change the attitude and the perception we have to the work in order to create something that's never been done before.
So roughly when was this?
This was 2000, 2001.
So as I hear you say that, he was bringing in the people aspects of what we do as project managers way back then when most of us were still being very clinical in our approach to project management.
Not only that, but think about this. The Agile Alliance didn't come into being until 2 years before he was looking at this. And this, like I said, I had a front row seat to seeing a guy who'd been doing projects for a couple decades. And he was actually talking about things that people were whispering in hallways. And it was like, oh, that's what this means.
So how do you sum up what you just said in terms of development approach versus, say, life cycle?
Okay, let's actually step back because we're using these words very commonly.
Yes.
Development approach and life cycle. Okay. How do you want to define these words so we can use them the rest of this show?
Well, now that you made me think about that, you're right. In fact, some places they're almost interchangeable, right? Here's how I would look at development approach as being the method that we use or the methodology. We give those names like when I was growing up in the industry, it was called waterfall. I think now we give it a more scientific name. We call it predictive.
Right.
And now many projects that I've been watching lately have gone into an agile methodology. So I would equate a methodology to something we call a development approach.
Let's think about this. Okay, that's the development approach, the development of the deliverable. Okay.
Yeah.
When we talk about the project life cycle, it's the process that a project goes through from its initiation to final transfer. It's the management. But the funny thing is, both project management and the work of the project, the creation of the deliverable itself, have an appropriate approach and an appropriate life cycle. They both have these. And you're right, development approach is the methodology, and the life cycle is the set of process, including the controls that actually approach this. And you have to admit, even though both methods that we look at, the predictive method and the agile method, and we can throw in the hybrid method there too, they actually describe how the work's to be done, but they also describe how the work is to be managed. And this is what we wrap our heads around. So when we talk about these things like methodologies and life cycles, yeah, they're the same, and they embrace something much bigger than just creating a deliverable. How's that for an answer?
That was a fairly lengthy answer, Tim. That was so I grew up in the world of waterfall, of predictive.
Uh-huh.
And typically, so that there was a certain methodology that invoked. We would term the life cycle in terms of the various phases that we went through in that much more sequential process. So we would have an initiation or planning phase. We would then have an analysis phase, then a design phase, then a development phase, then a testing phase, then an implementation phase. And so that entire sequence of phases is what we would call the life cycle. And then
Right.
we would put on top of that the project management processes, which had their own life cycle, but tied very much to the methodology of delivering the product.
Right. And what's weird, that's what we call predictive, right?
Yes.
Let's look at Agile and task boards or Kanban boards. Don't we do the same thing? Don't we create these steps that each one of the work items, whether we call them phases and work packages or whether we call them epics or features, don't we do the same thing? We do the same thing, except we approach the work in a little different manner.
Yeah, exactly. So we have, as you were saying, we have epics, we have features, we have the ones that I've been associated with. A lot of the work was broken into program increments.
Mm-hmm.
And so a program increment the end result of a program increment would be to have a finite deliverable from the process before we went on to the next set of features and epics. So
Right.
again, you're right. There's a life cycle in that. The one, I guess, Agile lends itself much more to a repetitive life cycle as opposed to a sequential life cycle that Waterfall presents.
Yeah, and that's right. And that's why we call Agile iterative and incremental, because it's iterative because we have these cycles of prototyping and review, which is continuous improvement. And then we have the incremental, which are the multiple releases that you might want to do. And they're stackable, or they can actually be improvements on the initial release. Now, again, these are only different approaches to the work, but they also talk about approaches to the control of the work itself.
That's exactly correct. And as you're talking about it, I was also thinking about when we deliver based on a waterfall methodology, we end up stringing that end result often for the projects that I was involved in anywhere from 2 to 4 years. That's a long time to wait for any kind of result. But that was the approach that was requested by the end user community so that they could end up getting their holistic system all at one time. So again, it depends on who's asking. It depends on the work to be delivered. And I think if we look at, you mentioned hybrid earlier, I think there's approaches that involve both some sort of sequential and some sort of agile processes that allow us to do these methodologies and these life cycles.
Right, right. And that's the key. They actually have the same role in projects, but the way they go about fulfilling that role is different.
Yeah.
based on the needs of the work and based on the needs of the organization. Right. Exactly right.
So I'm thinking that this last 10-minute discussion was probably beneficial in terms of getting the definition down, so that those folks who are listening to us right now, who are starting out their project management careers, can start to already think through what this really means in terms of selecting an approach to deliver their product.
And like I said, when I first started, it's something very simple. And we think it's inconsequential, but you can now start to realize if I don't do this well and I have a critical project, I could be sending the deliverable in a different direction. And it's like putting the wrong locomotive to a bunch of cars on a train.
Yes, it could. So let me throw another term in for our listeners. The term called cadence.
Oh, yes, let's talk about that one.
Well, again, using from my experience, the largest part of my experience being predictive methodologies for over 30 years. We had to develop a cadence to our systems. Even though we went through those phases I described earlier, we still put a cadence within the process so that we could always be managing. So, for example, we had our status meetings at exactly the same time on the same day every week. We had our issues and change request review meetings at exactly the same hour on the same day of the same part of the week. So we developed a cadence in terms of process, even though the phases themselves looked a lot different from each other, which I think is a little different than Agile.
Yeah, so let's talk about how important cadence is. It's like a marching band or like a bunch of soldiers in a group. Cadence is timing. And when we look at a band, a marching band especially, you can see how the timing can actually throw off the music. But in a project, could you imagine what happens if you don't get the cadence right?
Well, that's a perfect example, because a lot of my projects, well, every project that I worked on, we had people who had day jobs from the client side or from the customer side seconded to our projects. And so they helped us with requirements definition. They helped us understand what they need. They helped us test. And in doing so, they had to relieve themselves of their day jobs for those periods of time. Without that cadence, we would end up with a chaotic approach to any kind of project meeting, any kind of requirements definition, because people would never know when they were expected to be on site or working with us on the project.
Let's actually expand on this, because this is where it gets really fascinating. Okay, you have that timing that can be disastrous for the stakeholders' jobs in their organizations and their role in the project. Okay, they can misfire in both areas. Second of all, let's talk about the behavioral side. Remember Maslow and his hierarchy of needs? We have this need for emotional and psychological safety, right? And safety has a lot to do with predictability. And so if I don't have a sense of predictability and I know how this is going to go forward, we're going to have a meeting on Mondays, we're going to have a meeting on Wednesdays, we're going to wrap up on Fridays. If I don't have that sense, I'm going to be confused. I'm going to feel uncomfortable. It's not like I'm physically unsafe, but I'm intellectually and psychologically unsafe. I'm off balance for the whole week.
Well, exactly. And here's the other side of that is every person who's on the project, whether from the developer side or the client customer side, every person has a contribution to make. And without that cadence, if I'm expecting you, Tim, to deliver a report on a weekly basis, but you don't know that I'm going to always have that meeting on Friday at 2:00, How do you know when it is that you're supposed to get prepared to report out? That's just
Exactly.
that's just kind of a
Exactly.
minor example of, and again, you go back to the emotional, the safety issue. Yeah, if I'm going to look good on the project and contribute well to my fellow players, I need to know what that cadence is so that I can be ready and be on top of my game.
Now, let's see where the major issue is. Agile. At the
Yes.
beginning of an agile project, everything is an unknown. So how can you as a project manager establish a cadence outside of the work? Because in traditional projects, the work defines the cadence, right? Because we're going to have this phase, and here's the sequences, and here's the durations. The plan actually inherently based on the work itself, and you don't even have that in Agile. How do we actually build that cadence so people can feel comfortable and they can even start in a sense of that unknown state?
Well, in the projects that I was involved in that used Agile as a methodology, the cadence was developed as a part of the sprint process and as part of the ceremony process. So, for example, if we had 3-week sprints, all of the work for that grouping of deliverables, for that grouping of implementable pieces, there was that cadence within that particular, what we call a sprint. And so at the end of the sprint, we would have the ceremony called, let's do a review. Let's do a demonstration of what it is that we developed in that 3 weeks, as an example. So I think the cadence itself was within the pieces of work that we delivered at each sprint level.
That's exactly right. And that's the beautiful thing, where we don't have the work defined per se to develop the cadence. With Agile, we can use our Scrum ceremonies and artifacts. We have this wonderful Scrum framework, and we can apply it inside of an environment. And with our Agile attitude, we can actually create an environment that's safe through servant leadership. And we can actually create that by building healthy relationships early and by building that structure of communication, engagement, and relationship building even before the work is fully defined. That's the secret of Agile right there. And it all has to do with, is the work known or is it unknown? Do I rely on a plan for safety, or do I rely on my ceremonies for safety? You're exactly right.
But here's another aspect to that. The Agile projects that I've been involved in, we superimposed a project management cadence on top of the sprints. So we still had our weekly status reports. We had our monthly steering committee reports. We had the various meetings. So while the project's cadence was at the sprint level, the project management cadence was part of the weekly or biweekly or monthly aspect, so that we could always maintain that monitoring process, which I think in the predictive situation was more built into the process. This is superimposed on top of the process, but both resulted in good project management practice that was based on a cadence.
Yeah. It's the understanding of relationship and people's needs. And you know what you're describing? You're describing a hybrid methodology, not just in the scope, not just in the project and the product scope, but also in the control structure, in the communication, in the engagement, in the monitoring, in the analysis, and also the governance and compliance. Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, and I think what you just summed up also is it's necessary. Cadence, I believe, is necessary in order to be able to both influence and assist every stakeholder and every participant to truly do their job for the good of the project.
Yeah, and we understand this naturally as human beings. When we step together, it's very easy for us to act together. And that's what cadence does. It affects both the mind and the work itself.
This is kind of silly, but in many ways, as a youth growing up, I had a whole bunch of aunts and a couple of grandmothers. And it was amazing that whenever there were some festive times in my grandmother's little kitchen, 5 aunts, my mom, and my grandma could get together, and they had this cadence going where they could prepare a meal and nobody would step on anybody else's toes. But it was that practice, right? It was that knowing what you're doing and that process of going. So that was kind of a silly example, but it just reminded me of having seen that early on in my youth.
This actually gives us a step of time. It seems like we're painting a really good picture of how cadence and the development approach and life cycle actually influence both the project work and the behavior of the people who provide information and the experts and the teams and everything. How early can we actually start doing this? And that's my question.
Well, maybe, yeah. How early? I think right at the onset. And again, I can only speak from my experience because that's what I know. This isn't theory, but I came, and I've said this on many of our podcasts. I've had this discussion that I come from a background of having to bid for every job that I worked on. So we had to bid and win. And most, if not all of those are requests for proposal that we would bid into required us to state up front what our cadence, what our methodology, what our life cycle was going to look like for the duration of the project. So before they even selected us as the winning bid, we had to already have proposed that. And so you know what that takes? That takes a lot of discussion. And I remember a lot of long, long days discussing exactly for this particular project, how we would go into it, how we would create our teams, what methodologies we would use. We even had to put in our cadence of meetings and requirements for the client to be part of that. So when you say how early, that was in fact even before we won the project, before we even started it.
Now, that leads to a very interesting question that I want to spend time with on you. What tells you early in a project that this approach to the work is necessary? What tells you we need to have a schedule here? We need to have a backlog and epics and features. We need to have releases and reviews here. What are the things you look for that say this is this and that is that?
Well, in the bid process, it was pretty easy. A lot of times the customer would put a loose framework in that we had to bid to. So in those situations, some of that was dictated, although we had to put the process behind that outline. But largely, how do I say this? It comes from experience. This worked in this situation, this didn't. And so therefore, this situation looks like something I've seen before. So therefore, I'll apply this methodology or this process, as opposed to another one that might be equally useful. So I don't know. How do you say it's based on experience?
Let's actually put some actions and activities to this experience. It's a bit tacit. You're right. You're right. It's muscle memory that actually helps us.
Yeah.
What I like to look for is something called volatility. How quickly are these things changing from day to day? Yeah. Right? We think about volatility in the stock market, but volatility also happens in human behavior and decision making. I've been doing this. I'm part of a major bid for a project that's going to last for like 12 years on federal funding, right? We started off talking about this 4 weeks ago, and it looked like a simple project, right? All of a sudden, getting everything in place to build a relationship with the federal government. All the filings you have to be and all the data. And all of a sudden things get really crazy here for a while. And everybody has a sense of urgency that they didn't have like 24 hours ago. When I start seeing things like that, it's like, okay, maybe we have to think of this as not so simple. If the federal government doesn't think it's simple, It's us. And this is, like you said, it's assessing and analyzing your primary stakeholders that gives you a lot of this sense.
It does. And sometimes you don't know your stakeholders until you're actually in the project rubbing elbows with them. So
this is where I understand why training programs and university education focuses on stakeholders and stakeholder engagement. It's the clarification. The clarification is not in your own mind. The clarification that you own is also the clarification in the mind of the stakeholders. So this volatility can settle down and we can actually start listening to each other and talking to each other and making agreements.
So how we handle that, this is interesting. This is really interesting. And again, I'm going to come at it from the bid process where we had to bid to win to do the job, right? But I think the same processes are usable for internal IT organizations working in projects. But what we would do is when we would outline our approach, our methodology, our cadence, our approach, our process, all of that, even our timeline, when we would lay that out, we would add a section called, and here's your responsibility, Mr. Client. And in doing so, we would outline when they would get involved in the project, what we expected from them, what the timeliness of their responses, their reviews. We would put that right into the description of the process and the description of the approach. And as we did so, if they accepted our bid, that became part of the contract.
Yeah, yeah.
Suddenly, so we took care of a lot of the volatility just in our response to their request for proposal.
Yeah, it's a lot of relationship hand-holding, not necessarily process hand-holding, but it's actually just being there and being the calm support in the group and actually getting it's walking people away from the excitement and the anxiety, basically. Now, let me lay out an example for you. And
Okay.
this is where it gets interesting because I've had this happen on too many internal projects. For instance, let's talk about upgrading software. And the team goes into solution mode immediately. Oh, that's easy. All we're going to have to do is put software in place, make sure it's stable, train people, and we're done. And then all of a sudden, you have admins, you have like 50 emails from admins saying, do you know what this is going to do? It's going to wipe out a month of work for me because I'm going to be answering calls half the day from the users and you're destroying my life. And then you're going to get IT calling you and say, you can't do this because this is going to eliminate half of our jobs. And all of a sudden you thought that something was going to be a simple predictive activity is missing the beat.
And you forgot about the client calls that says, when you upgraded, you forgot to convert this piece of my database and now I can't do my job, right? So it's like, and then we go back and say, well, why didn't you test better? No, we don't.
Yeah. And this is the problem. And this is why we said early on in this show, it is critical for us to take a thoughtful approach in choosing the right methodology.
And the other thing we would do, Tim, after our bid was accepted and we got on site and we started working, was we delivered our first deliverable that is a favorite of yours. It's called the project charter.
Yes, it is.
And the project charter lays out what's expected of both parties such that that volatility you were describing earlier is lessened.
Yeah, and again, these tools like the project charter and the project plan, and even a timely and predictable release of these documents called a project charter and a project plan says, we're doing this in a methodical way. We have confidence, we have experience. Please listen to us and we'll get through this successfully. The establishment of the appropriate methodology and the establishment of cadence has a lot to do with how you demonstrate what you're doing on a project, not necessarily what you're delivering or what you expect others to do.
Well, and that lends itself to another question. The deliverable itself, how does that affect the choice of methodology or the choice of approach. Does that
That's,
fit into this at all?
oh, certainly, certainly, certainly. There's work that's highly unknown. We don't even know the technology of this major project that's going to last 10 to 15 years. We don't even know the technology that's going to have to be developed.
Oh, you're talking about your example, the one that you're involved in right now.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
gotcha.
And this major project. And so we can't really choose a predictive model.
Yeah.
And second of all, once we even know the technology, we're going to have to find a way to get enough experts in the room and the right experts to get that consensus so we can, and I'm not even talking about the implementation of the work itself, but I'm talking about creating environment so we can actually work together and come to an agreement of something that can actually be very, very awesome. See,
Yeah.
this is the thing in choosing methodologies, and this is why I say understanding relationships and individuals and behavior is a critical component of choosing the right methodology and the right life cycle for a project, especially when these projects are so serious and quote unquote, this project is too big to fail.
Yeah. So let me summarize what I just heard, because I think we just opened up something that is that even I probably didn't think about much through my career. But a lot of times the methodology we choose provides the deliverables that we're going to produce. The example you just stated almost looked like the deliverable is still in kind of a formative stage, and therefore the deliverable is kind of forcing the methodology to be selected based on what's coming out of the process that you're using to define the deliverable.
Yeah, our thinking right now, how do we influence a project's success or failure based on selecting the right methodology?
Boy, this goes back to the old chicken versus egg, right? What comes first, the chicken or the egg? In my
Right.
world, when I grew up, it was easy. The chicken came first. You always had methodology that drove the deliverables. But I can see in your situation, you've got the deliverables. Now you have to, or you've got the embryonic deliverables that you now have to figure out what the approach is that you're going to do to deliver those deliverables.
Yeah, this is the whole conundrum that Agile opened up in 2001. This work is really hard to define. Think about software development. This is Brooks and the Mythical Man Month. And Brooks was saying software development is not like any other work we've done before, right? Because the deliverable is without physical structure, and the deliverable is easily modifiable, and the deliverable can fit either in a huge box or in a little tiny chip. And how do we actually do these things? How does this change our approach to creating the deliverable, building a building versus writing software? And how does it change the expectations of our stakeholders? This is the whole thing that software development opened up, and it was a huge can of worms. Basically, all of a sudden, you see these developers saying, "Yeah, you told me it would take it would take 6 weeks to build a web page, and you've done it overnight." Okay, does that mean that I pay you 1 day's of 6 weeks effort? And also, you're looking at, oh, you got it done early. We have all this time. So why don't you pile on all this gold plating onto this and let's make it even bigger? And so how do I actually control this work and still keep the clients happy?
And you said something earlier about Fred Brooks and the Mythical Man Month. Was it Fred Brooks? Have I got that right?
Yeah, Fred Brooks, that's right.
What do you think he'd say today in Agile? Because my limited experience with Agile suggests that no, the Mythical Man Month, if you add people, you don't necessarily shorten the time. But in Agile, you can add a whole new sprint team if your deliverable is logically broken out. And so you can parallel more work with more sprint teams, can't you?
Yeah. See, Brooks was a project manager of the IBM mainframe operating system. Okay. He led the team that developed that for IBM. And he said there are quite a few problems. And he actually created the framework for the theory of constraints, right? I want it fast, I want it cheap, I want it fancy, right? With software development, you start getting into these problems. And so he was talking about all these things. And I think Fred would be rather interested to see we've broken it up into two pieces. Number one, it's an attitude, it's a perception, it's a behavior. And number two, it's a set of tools. You have to look at things from a different standpoint. You use the work itself to define the toolkit that you bring in. You may have to approach the work itself and how you measure in a different manner too. And this is where we get to actually start thinking about these little nuanced decisions that we're making and that we're actually getting people to realize and become aware of early and influencing those decisions so that they're earlier and they're more responsive to not just the needs of getting a deliverable out, but also getting people to continue to agree as you move forward. How's that?
Yeah, no, that's good. And I think the other part of that whole thing is when you're looking at it from that perspective, and maybe when I'm looking back at my career and having done so many of these projects, the nuance almost comes as part of the naturally innate by now through experience, problem solving, solution solving process that is already part of our being as project managers. It's something that we don't often have to really sit down and think through because we react based on sort of a sixth sense to those nuances.
Here is where Project Management Institute was brilliant. In 2015, they said project managers have to learn much more about leadership, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, influence, motivation, negotiation, and all these wonderful leadership tools, right? What they were saying is, I have to position my people to be ready. I have to create that environment to be ready for people to work in uncomfortable situations where they feel they're a little bit out of control. They don't know the direction they need to go, but they have opinions and they're experts. And that's what the job of project management is. And we've talked about this, and we talk about this on each show. See, choosing the appropriate methodology, it has little to do with, do I use a Gantt chart or a backlog? It has everything to do is, how do I prepare the people to be comfortable and confident to make the work to make the decisions and do the work that I know they can.
Well, and the other part of that is, as a project manager, one of my jobs was to keep people effectively working pretty much every hour of the day. And the only way you could do that was allowing for overlap between those phases. We talked about part of that cadence, but it also was involved in the selection of those people. I've talked about when you build a house, it's pretty easy. Everything is sequential, right? The plumbers can't do anything until the framers are finished. The sheetrock people can't do anything until the plumbing and the electrician wire is in. Well, when you're dealing with IT projects and you've got the stable of people that are working, you want them to be productive at all times. Part of your job in preparing them for the job is also to be able to prepare them for those overlaps in the review cycles. So that's also adds to the nuance and to the challenges that we face as project managers when we're selecting our approach, our cadence, our methodology, and all of the things that go into that.
A lot of people, once they start getting into Agile, they start saying, am I allowed to do that? Do I have permission? And that's the problem, because Agile is built for that. In Agile, you have this ability to go back to the backlog and reprioritize.
True.
And basically, the thing is, there are a set of metrics that we can use both in Agile and predictive projects. And it's not just earned value, okay? What we're talking about are things like velocity. Is the project itself moving forward? Is it moving forward against the big picture? Is it moving forward towards the little pieces, like the features and the use cases and the user stories? Are we progressing? Are we moving forward? And that gives you enough of a handle to start saying, okay, if not, let's work backwards and find that root cause. In predictive projects, you have those very precise metrics because you have a very precise calendar, and you can get into those earned value and these other tools that we have that actually say, boom, here's the answer right here.
I'll tell you though, where predictive, in my experience, can fall down, and that is, yes, it is very discrete in terms of those parts of the schedule that you can predict. But when you get to the very, very end and your user sees during user acceptance tests the deliverable itself, and they come to the realization that the information they gave you was interpreted slightly differently, and so they ended up getting something they weren't expecting, that's where the predictive can slap you in the face. Whereas in Agile, my experience has been there that when you have those reviews at the end of every sprint, you can make corrections immediately because the users can say, no, that's not what I meant when I said that. And so it's after 3 weeks as opposed to after 3 years, you're doing your corrective cycle.
Exactly. And think about it this way. In a traditional project, we're still in planning, right? And we'll agree, and then we'll be in working. And we'll still do a little planning, but we're working. And then we're monitoring, controlling while we're working. You don't have a deliverable until you're a third of the way through the plan, and you only show a partial deliverable, right? Where in Agile, we're focusing on what is important for the deliverable and the stakeholders. Is this what you mean? Is this what it looks like? Is this what it feels? What's your sensation about this? So we can talk about not just functionality, but value.
And how many times, even in my coursework years ago, how many times did I have it drummed into me? The earlier you can catch your error, the better results you'll have. Mm-hmm. At least Agile allows you to catch those errors of interpretation, certainly, early on, so that you end up delivering something much closer to the expectation of your end user.
One of the things that is a big hurdle for the project managers that I've worked with is, am I allowed to make mistakes? And you're right. It's fail early is a precept. It's basically a foregone conclusion with Agile. It's making mistakes early because you make mistakes in this stuff that's easily flexible. Yeah. So that you don't make mistakes later. And this is the beautiful thing.
Which we keep come back to the domain of the domain that we're talking about here in terms of selecting the correct delivery approach or whatever it is. All of these things that we're talking about, like the last one you talked about with mistakes, all of that is part of that selection process. And it all feeds into the same thing. And by the way, I have a confession to make. I have made mistakes. I think most people have.
And preparing for a very grueling exam, it's hard for me to teach managers and executives to accept that wrong answers have more value often than correct answers is. And it's really hard to help people get over that hurdle of perception that I want to achieve. I don't want to make mistakes. But the bottom line, and this is a Peter Drucker statement, basically, you cannot improve on being correct. You can't make things better.
That's true.
You can make better on things that you can correct. And this is why this is a leadership versus management decision. This is where leadership has a great emphasis on how we understand humans think and behave and believe.
So I think one of the biggest mistakes, though, that we can as a project team make is selecting the wrong approach.
Oh,
What do you think? What do you think contributes to, say, a project manager or that team getting something wrong in terms of selecting their approach to delivery?
a lot. It's first not understanding what to look for. And second, I think I've talked to you about this before. I know we've mentioned it. Allowing the team to go into solution mode too early.
Yeah.
I'd like to dig into that. What that means a lot to me. It's basically trying to solve a problem before we understand the problem. Would you like to add to a little bit of that?
In my experience, we didn't get into a lot of that simply because we had such a very disciplined approach. As I mentioned earlier, our business was bidding to win. We had such a disciplined approach to every single response to a request for proposal that we didn't get into oversimplifying or over solutioning too early. We definitely put our approach and our process in place. So I can't say that I have a lot of experience with that. I can't say that everything we ever did was perfect, because it wasn't. But a lot of times we avoided what you're just describing because we did a lot.
One of the great hurdles I had was actually teaching stakeholders that creating the deliverable wasn't their job.
Yeah.
Getting the stakeholders themselves getting into the solution space before the requirements were well defined.
Yeah.
And this is creating the perception of success before you really understand the definition of success. And this is where I've seen a lot of my mistakes being made. Spending the time to work with my stakeholders and training them into, okay, what are you doing with the requirements? How are you helping us? You're not helping us by saying, here's the size of the box and here's the material of the box. What you need to help me with is understand, why does the box have to be rigid? Why does the box have to be black? And why does it have to have a hole in the top? And based on what your input is, we have engineers who actually can give you exactly the specifications that'll meet your need.
Well, when you talk about that, I was often critical of the earlier versions of the project management, the PMI, the body of knowledge, simply because I felt it was too formulaic and too process driven and too cookie cutter thing. Even though I know that they didn't mean to come across that way, it seemed to come across that way. And I think what ended up happening was a lot of people would confuse the selection of the approach with this very cookie cutter, very formulaic approach to, this is how you do projects. Particularly when the process groups were defined, people would often confuse methodology with those process groups, or approach with process groups.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And that's where people say, no, we're not doing any work, we're planning. No, we're not monitoring, controlling here. We're getting work done. It's like, wait. Let's think about this. Okay, these are systems, these are functions, these are processes that run in and out, and they're constantly going on, and they're not intended to be quote unquote phases. Yeah. And that's a huge hurdle. I think spending time in educating people about the function and the context of projects and why projects have to have this discussion before we even get into planning is critical.
Well, exactly. A lot of people think, hey, I've done my project plan, I'm done for the rest of the project. What they don't really understand is planning continues on right through the closing of that project.
Yeah, as one of my mentors said, the objective of planning is not the plan. It's the objective of planning is the process of planning,
Yeah.
and planning and replanning and planning and replanning and rebaselining.
So I think we're coming towards the end of our discussion today. This has been great. So again, I love to turn everything we say to the benefit of those people who are developing a career as project managers. And if I were to sum up our discussion to lay out the most important processes to come up with the correct development approach for any system they're working on, how would I sum that up, do you think?
Number one, having a distinct effort of formally accepting and gaining consensus on methodology is critical for any project.
And you mentioned educating on that process once you come to that decision.
Right. And maintaining engagement and commitment and consensus on that decision. So if things change, that methodology will be able to be change quickly.
And a lot of that can come with the cadence you establish early on.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's when I look at it and I think, why am I struggling defining this? Because it's so second nature. And yet maybe it's in the explanation that you realize that the importance of it takes away from the second nature and really makes you want to think through the whole process.
This is one of these riding a bike topics and one of these conversations of riding a bike. Balance on a bicycle is simple until you look at the physics of it.
Well, until you try to describe how to balance, you cannot learn how. This is good. I like this. You can't learn how to balance on a two-wheel bicycle by reading a book.
Right. You can observe it and
Yes.
learn. You can participate it and learn. But it's like swimming and riding a bike. This is what we call tacit knowledge versus explicit knowledge. There's no checklist. There's no schedule for us to follow. We have to be able to get in and get our hands in the work in order to understand it. And this is where I would suggest to people, start playing with this and see what the results are. Do some experiments and try to define a methodology even before you fully understand what methodology and life cycle means. Because if enough people ask you, you're going to look up the definition, and then you're going to internalize that definition. And again, it's going to take 3 or 4 iterations, and then things are going to make a lot of sense.
Well, and I often wondered when I was going through the body of knowledge version 7, why domains suddenly became so important and why this is part of a domain. But this is one of those, selecting the correct methodology and development approach is one of those critical components of delivering a good system for your end user base.
Oh, exactly. I have enjoyed this conversation immensely. I can't wait for us to talk about our next domains and the following ones. And then I don't want to talk too much about the future, but I wonder what we're going to be talking about next.
We'll have to maybe do what was it in Agile? You do a retrospective and then you do your planning, right? So maybe we'll
exactly. I'd like to do that. We do a retrospective, and then let's do an iteration 0.
So until next time.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, everyone, for checking in with us. And thank you, Merv, for a very stimulating conversation.
Absolutely.